Bumpy streets, crumbling buildings, endless queues for food, and salaries that barely reach $25. This is the real Cuba, far removed from the postcard images of old cars and infectious music that many people know. Today, Bello Mundo takes you to the side that nobody shows, revealing why, even decades after the revolution, the island still faces a harsh reality of poverty, scarcity, and improvisation. And here's a spoiler. No, the American embargo isn't the only explanation. Number 1. Location and geography. Located in the heart of the Caribbean, Cuba is the largest island in the Antilles archipelago and the most populous in the region. With an area of around 110,000 square kilometers, its shape resembles the outline of a crocodile that stretches between the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean Sea, and the Atlantic Ocean. For this reason, many Cubans affectionately call it El Caimán. Cuba's geography is a real mix of natural beauty. The main island has more than 5,000 kilometers of coastline, adorned with white sand beaches, protected coves, and coral reefs that look like they're straight out of a postcard. Inland, the landscapes vary between the imposing Sierra Maestra Mountains, famous for their role in the Cuban Revolution, and vast plains where tobacco and sugarcane plantations predominate, symbols of the local economy. With a tropical climate, Cuba has two well-defined seasons: the dry season, from November to April, and the rainy season, from May to October. Despite this, the sun shines practically all year round, guaranteeing the typical Caribbean scenery that attracts tourists from all over the world. And of course, the capital, Havana, deserves to be highlighted. Its historic streets, full of colonial mansions and classic cars from the 50s, turn the city into a veritable open-air museum. No wonder its historic center has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But if Cuba's geography is an invitation to enchantment, its history reveals a very different side. Number 2. History. To understand Cuba's contrasts, it's essential to know a little about its history. The island was colonized by the Spanish at the end of the 15th century. During this period, the arrival of enslaved Africans completely changed the composition of the population and the local culture. For centuries, Cuba was a Spanish colony until it gained its independence at the end of the 19th century. But freedom came with a strong influence from the United States, which controlled much of the island's economy and politics. This relationship was severed in 1959, when Fidel Castro led the Cuban Revolution and established a socialist government. This caused a rift with the United States and started an economic embargo that, in a way, is still in force. In the beginning, Cuba had the support of the Soviet Union, which helped fund areas such as health and education. However, with the end of the Soviet Union in the 90s, the country plunged into a deep crisis, known as the Special Period, marked by shortages of food and basic resources. Today, Cuba is governed by Miguel Díaz-Canel, who took over from Raúl Castro, Fidel's brother. Although some economic changes have taken place, the government retains control over most of the economy and daily life on the island. Number 3. Economy and embargoes. When someone asks, why is Cuba so poor? The most common answer from the government and many supporters is almost always the same: the economic embargo. The blockade imposed by the United States in 1962 restricts direct trade with the island. To this day, it is seen as the main villain behind the country's economic difficulties. But is this explanation enough? Think about it. Cuba is not isolated from the world. The island does business with countries like Germany, Japan, Mexico, Brazil, Canada, and China. This alone shows that the embargo isn't the only culprit, right? What's more, American products can be purchased through intermediaries such as Mexico and Panama. Some economists have an answer for this. The problem lies not only in external restrictions, but also within the country itself. The government controls almost all resources and makes it difficult for businesses to grow. Without the freedom to undertake, modernize sectors and attract investment, productivity is low and Cuba depends on imports to meet even basic needs. Want an example? In 2007, Raúl Castro gave land to private farmers to increase food production. It seemed like a good idea, but without tools, machinery, or transportation, much of the harvest was lost. In 2009, hundreds of tons of tomatoes rotted for lack of logistics. And this is not an isolated case. So while the embargo is an important piece of the puzzle, it is far from the only problem. For many Cubans, everyday life brings challenges that go beyond political and economic issues. And it's this side that we'll show you next. Number 4. Difficulties getting food. One of the biggest challenges of daily life in Cuba is getting food on the table. Products such as chicken, powdered milk, cooking oil, and even personal hygiene items often disappear from the shelves, creating a constant cycle of shortages and waiting. In state-run stores, each person is entitled to a limited quota: 2 packets of sausages, a few boxes of cereal, a handful of yogurts, and a small amount of detergent. Doesn't sound like much. That's because it really is. And if the chicken, for example, runs out before it's your turn, you won't be able to try again until the following month. It's not uncommon to find shelves full of just one product, such as sausage or low-quality sausages. Those who want something more varied have to turn to the informal market, where prices are much higher. And for those who don't have access to foreign currency, such as dollars or euros, the situation is even more complicated, as salaries in Cuban pesos barely cover basic needs. The reality is even more evident at the famous Cuatro Caminos store in Havana. There, consumers have to queue for days in a bureaucratic process. Each person has to register their card and is given a group number. If you are, for example, in group 27, there are at least 1,300 people in front of you. Even after days of waiting, entering the store doesn't mean finding what you need. Often, what's available are a few packets of sausages, yogurt, or cleaning products. The basics may simply not be there. In tourist areas, those who work directly with visitors have some advantage, as tips in foreign currency can help. But for the average Cuban, basic items such as meat, rice, or toothpaste become real luxury items. In other words, long waits, few options, and a lot of uncertainty. A daily struggle to put food on the table. Number 5. Freedom of expression. Behind Cuba's warm smile and infectious music lies a very different reality: censorship. The country is often listed among the places with the least freedom of the press and expression in the world. The media is controlled by the government, and although the internet has advanced in recent years, it still faces severe restrictions, frequent signal cuts, and data plans so expensive that they are unaffordable for most Cubans. Speaking your mind can be costly. Independent journalists, activists, and even ordinary citizens who dare to criticize the government report persecution, arbitrary arrests, and, in some cases, exile. Publishing something on social media or organizing a protest is a risk that few dare to take. In videos produced by Cubans, you can see how speaking openly about the island's difficulties is an act of great courage. Any content that reveals problems, such as supply failures, the precariousness of the system, or the daily hardships of the population, can be grounds for repression. Number 6. Working conditions. For decades, tourism has been one of the few opportunities for those seeking a slightly better life in Cuba. Working in hotels, resorts, or tourism companies, even in difficult conditions, offers the chance to receive tips in euros, dollars, or other hard currencies. For many, these tips are the only way to get basic products without facing the endless queues at state-run stores. But this opportunity is not available to everyone. A large proportion of Cubans work in formal jobs with extremely low salaries, paid in Cuban pesos, which have very little value on the international market. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and nurses, despite their qualifications, earn so little that they end up having to look for alternatives in order to survive. It's not uncommon to see highly qualified professionals abandoning their careers in search of extra income. Some become motorcycle cab drivers, offering cheaper rides than traditional cabs. Others turn their homes into small, informal businesses, selling food, drinks, or anything that can generate a profit. However, the road to informality is not easy. Reports of goods being seized, heavy fines, and orders to close down are frequent. State control hinders even the most basic attempts at entrepreneurship. Another complicated issue is sex tourism. In tourist areas, especially on the beaches, men and women end up getting involved in exchanges of favors or companionship for money or goods brought by foreign visitors. This reality is fueled by poverty and a lack of opportunities, which push many into vulnerable situations. Meanwhile, the queue to get a job in the tourism sector only grows, and those who don't get a job have to deal with constantly rising prices and a lack of access to hard currency. Number 7. Racial inequality and equality. Even though the official discourse speaks of equality for all, racial inequality in Cuba is still a reality. Since the Cuban Revolution, the government has declared an end to racism, but in everyday life things are very different. Black or mixed-race people find it harder to get better jobs, especially in the most valued sectors, such as tourism or important government positions. Studies show that lighter-skinned people are more likely to take jobs that deal directly with foreign tourists, which guarantees access to tips in hard currency, such as dollars or euros. This ends up creating a significant difference, as these opportunities are much more lucrative. When it comes to gender equality, there are positives. Women are well represented in areas such as education and medicine, but they still face challenges. Many end up overburdened with household chores and depend on financial help from relatives abroad to get basic things like hygiene products and clothes. In short, even with progress, the promise of equality is still far from being a reality for everyone in Cuba. Number 8. Infrastructure and services. Cuba's infrastructure problems are another major challenge. Potholed streets, buildings that look like they're about to collapse, and precarious sewage systems are part of everyday life for those living on the island. In cities like Havana, it's common to see broken pipes wasting water, while entire neighborhoods go for weeks without a supply. Water flows through the streets, but doesn't reach the taps. Away from the tourist areas, the problems are even more visible. Neighborhoods like Los Sitios in Centro Habana are considered dangerous, not because of crime, but because of the condition of the buildings, which could collapse at any moment. Huge queues at state-run stores are also common, as are elderly people living on minimum pensions of $12 a month. Many people have to go to welfare canteens or even look in the garbage for something they can sell. Locals that were once luxurious, such as Calle Monte, are now marked by worn-out buildings and the informal commerce that dominates the streets. Public transport, with old buses that are always full, is another problem. Those who can pay for almendrones, old cars that work like shared cabs, or motorcycle cabs, which are expensive and inaccessible to many. What about the electricity supply? It's a constant headache. Frequent blackouts, which can last for hours, harm businesses and residents. Without generators, many face food spoiling and lost sales. In Cuba's intense heat, without fans or air conditioning, the situation becomes unbearable. When it comes to housing, conditions are also worrying. In old buildings in the center of Havana, balconies are collapsing and structures depend on improvised beams to keep them from falling. For tourists, it may seem like a nostalgic charm, but for those who live there, it's a daily risk. Number 9. Health and education. Cuba is famous for its advances in health and education, but the reality, as always, has two sides. On the one hand, the country has one of the highest literacy rates in the Americas, and its public health system is recognized worldwide. Cuban doctors, for example, are sent on international missions, and the island's medical training is highly respected. On the other hand, the challenges in the health sector are not small. Despite being free, access to basic care is not always easy. Many hospitals face a lack of resources, old equipment, and even medicines. Outside Havana, the situation can be even more precarious, and it is not uncommon for patients to need to bring sheets, medicines, and even light bulbs to their hospital rooms. In education, basic training is universal, but there are also limitations. The content taught in schools and universities is strongly guided by the government's principles. Careers such as journalism or law, for example, face difficulties in promoting free debate and independent research. So, while literacy is practically total, the education system also functions as a tool of control, limiting freedom of thought and discussions about the country's future. Number 10. The future. So, what does the future hold for Cuba? Well, that question leaves a lot of people unanswered. On the one hand, the U.S. embargo continues to stand in the way of economic growth. On the other hand, within the island, the lack of bolder reforms makes the country seem stuck in time. Meanwhile, young people continue to leave the island, looking elsewhere for what they can't find at home. Opportunities. For those who remain, the reality is cruel. Elderly people survive on pensions of $12 a month, and most workers earn salaries that hardly exceed $25. It's not hard to imagine the impact this has on all aspects of life: health, education, infrastructure, and even tourism, which was once one of the island's great attractions. But the challenges don't stop there. Discouragement is already reflected in everyday life, with an increase in drug use and alcoholism, often used as an escape from the harsh reality. While neighboring countries are taking advantage of tourism to reinvent themselves, Cuba seems to be stuck in a long pause. The island has a people full of creativity and resilience, but this alone is not enough to overcome such huge barriers. Without change, the future remains as uncertain as the present. What do you think of this panorama? Were you surprised, or did you already know that Cuba, as well as being an exotic destination stuck in time, also has so many challenges? Share your opinion and send this content to anyone who likes to explore what lies behind the stories of famous places. Thank you for following along, and we'll see you on our next Bello Mundo adventure. Until then.